Judy Hellman, who's been an editorial collective member since I first created the editorial collective in the mid-90s. After Miliband died, I was deathly afraid that the Register would bite the dust on my watch. And I didn't have the kind of confidence that Miliband and Saville had that you could run this thing on your own. So what kept me going was that editorial collective. And Judy has written a number of times in the Register, as has her partner Steve Hellman, who exemplifies, I think, the way in which he could write essays for the Register on the Italian Communist Party, never denigrating it, but looking at, from the beginning, at least when he started doing this, the contradictions in it, the limits inside it, etc., that have now led it to be slightly probably right of the American Democratic Party.
Thank you. I, of course, am very pleased to be here and to have this chance. And I'd like to say that the occasion of this event led me to sit down and reread Leo's fantastic piece in the Current Issue, which surveys the whole history of the Register. I had seen it when I guess it was a final draft, and he circulated it as he does to the members of the editorial board. And I looked at it real quickly, and I said, "Oh, this is excellent. Can hardly wait to read it in hard copy." And so I did. I really went over it very carefully for today, and I finally came to an understanding of. I had an answer for a question that had not preoccupied me unduly, but it had been around in my head since 1999, and that was, how did I get to be in the Register talking about the movement in Chiapas? And in looking at what Leo had to say about the basic principles, let's say what he calls the consistent perspective of the Register, among them the refusal to indulge in passing fads, in quoting Miliband saying that now widely understood among socialists that we can no longer have the dogmatic reiteration of ideas from the past. Leo goes on to detail the intellectual commitments of the Register over time, and some of them he's spoken to today, but of course what I did was I picked out the intellectual commitments that helped me explain why Chiapas and why an article entitled Magic Realism and the Left, Real and Virtual Chiapas. How did that come to be? And I saw it does fit. It fits with work of John Sauls, and early, in one of his early decades, where he wrote with, Leo cites an article that he wrote with Giovanni Arrighi on nationalism and revolution in Africa. He cites works of Eric Hobsbawm on guerrillas in Latin America. He cites Lucio Magri's work on the French May. And he does so calling our attention to, I'll quote him exactly, that the Register would remain no less sober about the student revolts of the 1960s, not to mention the problems of trying to emulate Che or Mao, or Lenin and Trotsky for that matter. That it was dedicated, well, put it this way, one of the commitments that it made and to which it dedicated itself over all these decades was to avoid the wearing of what Leo calls rose-colored glasses. And that for sure applies to the piece that I can say Leo solicited from me, because as you know, most of what appears are articles that are commissioned, and which Leo, his various co-editors over time, and at times the rest of us sitting around his dining room table, come up with in terms of names of people who would write on a variety of subjects that would fit the themes that have been selected in the famous 5-year plans. As Leo says, the last of the 5-year plans. In any event, the way it came about for me was that I had returned from Chiapas in 1999, where over the course of the sabbatical I had done a lot of work. And Leo, in his way, said simply, we have, person who does a great Leo is my husband, Steve. But I'll do my best. We have to have a piece on Chiapas. And I said, well, I don't think you and Colin, his co-editor of the day, are going to like what I have to say. He said, oh, I can't imagine that. And I ran by them a little sketch of what I had to say. And they seemed to like it well enough. And so it was that I sat down and wrote the 15,000 words that I had been led to understand I was going to have a chance to communicate to the world through the register. And they cut it to 12,000, and that's never painless in its way, but that was okay. And in fact, when I reread it to think through my thoughts for today, I decided, they were right. So it's a little belated, Leo, and I hope I'll remember to communicate.
It was Colin who did all the cutting.
I know, he had his way, and I might say that Colin's editing was something else. Colin was a person who made me feel relaxed about what I have to recognize as a fetish for good grammar. I mean, he just notched it up even further. All that said, I sent this in, and there's a lot of toing and froing because it was very hard-hitting. It was not, as later critics would allege, in any way, shape, or form an attack on the Zapatistas, let alone on Su Comandante Marcos, although there's much to be said about Su Comandante Marcos. And at this point, I hardly need to say it because most of his most passionate fans have come to feel perhaps not. Or they've moved on to other heroes. I would say that there are a lot of Chavistas in this world who were previous admirers of Su Comandante Marcos, who in the end fell short for his admirers in many respects. All that said, I produced this article. And with criticism back and forth, lots of working together, which is very much part and parcel of the process, it was published in 1999 in the issue that carries the date 2000. And before it was even published in the Register, it actually was translated and came out in a Mexican magazine called Este País and very widely circulated in Latin America, which was just as well because in Latin America it had many fans. And in fact, I can't actually think of anyone who wrote to me suggesting that I do myself in one ugly way or another from Latin America. However, this same piece that was cut to 12,000 words, in fact, elicited a critique from an aggrieved webmaster. It came altogether to 32,000 words. And how do I know that? I marked a block and I called up, the word count, and there it is. Okay, so what kinds of things could elicit such a response? What kinds of ideas? And I'll mention just a few because I think it's emblematic of what the Socialist Register has and can do. For starters, I want to say that the Register is the only place I could have published this. I would never have dreamed. I could have published it elsewhere, but it would have seemed not a critique from the left, but simply carping at decent people who deserve our respect. But in the pages of the Register, it became something precisely because it is the Register, and I think that says everything, where people on the left could look at themselves and could see whether this is an area for self-criticism. The area, that, of course, that I touched upon is the doing of politics through electronic means. And what does that mean? What does it mean that we can sit at home in a certain amount of comfort, if not in an ergonomically correct chair, and support a cause by moving our cursor over a button? Is that good for us? Is that bad for us? What does it mean that we can, I think even more importantly, decide that we don't want to support a movement or a person or a good cause simply by deleting just as fast as it comes on the screen, just throw it away. And we don't have anyone knocking on our door to whom we have to explain why we're not going to sign a petition. And we don't have to, as the Italians say, descend into piazza to encounter other people and discuss with them and to work things through. And so part of what inspired this was that kind of critique, or let's say a questioning of what electronic means In what respects electronic means gives us new power, and in what respect it takes away from us some very, very important human experiences that are part of being in a movement, that are part of being a member of a larger social community, larger social and political community. And so that was part of what, in fact, has made this piece for me something, probably of all the things all the articles I've ever written, one of the most important in terms of a constant flow of people who communicate with me. I don't think a month goes by that I don't hear, in particular from graduate students who are interested in the whole issue of electronic, the impact of electronic communication on politics. And so that's been a very, very interesting and fulfilling aspect of it. I'll just very, very briefly give you some sense of what riled people and what I think is the possible contribution that I was able to make because Leo and Colin and the board and so forth stood by me in my desire to get these thoughts out there. And I'll just say very, very quickly to give you an idea of the content. What I argue is that electronic communication, above all the fact that it was in the hands of a very tiny number of people who were reproduced around the world, who were translated into many languages, but ultimately came to about 2 or 3 people who were webmasters and who did all of the communication, had the great benefit of rescuing people in Chiapas from being massacred. The world knew everything every day, and you could plug in and you could be part of rescuing very, very powerless people who were in great danger. That was the good side. But the bad side, in my view, was that people who would never dream of reading the bourgeois press without a critical lens on, accepted basically everything that these webmasters had to say as the gospel truth. Okay, and I felt that it simply flattened what was going on in real Chiapas, that in essence, virtual Chiapas was out there for us, but it bore very little relationship to the reality on the ground. And I'll give you 3 examples very quickly to give you a sense of what I mean, that the simplification of what happened in Chiapas made it very difficult for us to understand or come to reasonable conclusions about where this was going to lead. And the 3 areas I've simply mentioned in passing are that everybody knew that 56% of land in Chiapas was in, quote, private hands. But the virtual version of this was that it was somehow in the hands of large landowners. And in fact, it was overwhelmingly in the hands of very, very poor minifundistas, people who had a sub-family farm, in short, incredibly poor people. And so that land struggles in Chiapas, rather than being the standard large landowner against the landless peasant, actually played out as a war of the poor. Related to this was a celebration of indigenous people that gave us to understand that the Zapatistas had organized all indigenous people, and that was that, and that all the indios were people who we would, of course, want to support. And this notion reached, in terms of its reception in the outer world, on Chiapas, reached its height with the arrival of 134 Italian activists who came to Chiapas dressed in these jackets that read, "Somos todos indios," we are all Indian. It was their expression of solidarity with the people they expected to meet. And in one of the first villages they got to, where they were ready to offer their solidarity and their material aid, they were received with machete and stick-wielding people who were short of stature and very brown and were indeed indios themselves. And of course, it is the case that these were indigenous people who were organized by and gave their allegiance to the governing party, to the PRI. They were PRIista indios, but they were indios nonetheless. And so it's in this sense that the reception of an image of Chiapas outside, that it was indios against blancos, that it was not reflected by anything on the ground. And finally, the last example I think I can give is that what the electronic communication always referred to as civil society, basically when it came down to it, was an estimated 750 NGOs, both Mexican and foreign, who, will anyone in this room be very surprised, were at odds with each other as often as they were able to cooperate. In fact, far more often than they were able to cooperate as a body Okay, so in essence, I argue that the reality in Chiapas was simplified, flattened, distorted by the transmission and the retransmission of the same kind of material over and over again, uncritically received by enthusiastic people around the world, but particularly more in Europe even than in North America. And that it required our thinking, that the whole matter, it raises the whole matter of what it means to sit back in a receptive manner, both in the positive and negative sense, and to act from the perspective of electronic communication, something that's only gotten more so, obviously, in the years since 2000. So this is just my moment to thank Leo and to thank everyone involved with the Register for making it possible to make that kind of argument without being run out of town to argue that. So I thank you.